So Bob, 40 years at NBC, 25 on the Today Show, an incredible tenure, went to the University of Kansas, did your graduate program at this small upstate New York journalism school, and on your last Today Show broadcast, you said your next story was about teaching the next generation.
That's correct.
And that's what you're doing now?
Well, I figure anybody who's been around professionally and they get into their 40s, if they don't start giving something back, then by the time you reach my age, all you're going to do is sit on your front lawn saying, "Get off my lawn!" You know, because they don't understand what you do and how to do it, and so therefore the next generation is going to fail. Well, the golden age of any profession is 2 weeks before you joined. Everybody my age is going to tell you that. But I figure that even though when I came to Syracuse, all the cutting edge stuff that I enjoyed is now in a museum, the one thing that hasn't changed here at Syracuse is how to tell a good story. So for instance, I mean, I did almost 4,000 stories at NBC. They hired me when I had red hair and freckles, and they took me all the way to gray hair. And I found those stories not by being lucky, but by using the techniques of storytelling to figure out what am I seeing right in front of me. Because a lot of times we pass by really good stories.
And do you think that with today, obviously over 40 years, the medium has changed so much, do you think that there is a problem with the long-form story sort of becoming a dying art because of how obsessed today's generation is with just quick hits, the quick facts?
I don't think so. I mean, we haven't seen it yet in television, but look at what's happened in radio. Now they call it podcasting. Mm-hmm. It's radio theater is what it is, but it's long-form storytelling. So, but it's not so important how long it is. I think in a 59-second story, you can have a beginning, middle, and ending, and a great, strong central character, and people will want to know more, and they'll come back the next day for 59 seconds. I mean, you can't tell me that a country western songwriter hasn't been writing it at a Twitter length for years, and you're still humming it and you know the words. So the length has nothing to do with it, it's how you approach it. Most people in journalism only get to the reporting side. They know enough to be able to gather and tell a pretty decent story. But the flip side of that coin is storytelling. No matter how good your story is, nobody's going to remember it unless you tell it well. And that's the most important thing to learn. And
over your 40 years, 4 million miles traveled, as you've said, how do you find that story? How does your eye manage to dig through and say, that's the story that I want to tell?
Well, all of my in-laws are cops, and they gave me a tip when I was about your age. They said, listen, you know, as you watch your favorite police show, the first person who talks in an interrogation room loses because they tell you things that you didn't know them well enough to ask for. And I said, well, what are you talking about? And they said, well, didn't you notice that when people ask you a question, they give you an answer that they think you've asked for, and then they explain their answer. And he says, what you media types don't do is to stop talking, because you'll jump in with the next question, because that's how we're trained, right? He says, but if you just pause a second or two, people get uncomfortable because they say, well, maybe they didn't understand. And they go, well, dummy, that's why I killed my wife. And you know, you were there trying to talk them into a bunco charge or something, and you find out that they murdered somebody last night because they filled the silence. I call that the Delta technique. If you're on Delta Airlines going home for Thanksgiving and you pay even a second or two to the person sitting next to you, they tell you everything that you don't want to hear. But as a storyteller, if you guide them to the point that you're interested in, you can use that same technique, let them fill the silence, and they come up with better answers than you knew them well enough to ask.
And so what are you teaching students today? What exactly is the essential bullet point rundown of what today's journalists leaving the school and going into the field should know?
Well, I think, you know, in the 4 years that you're here or longer, you're really spending too much time focusing on getting the circus tent up every night. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, there's so much complication. I'm not telling you anything. So many complicated new ways of doing things and saying things. Just to master the art, the technical art, is difficult. But what we forget is that the people who come to the circus tent just assume the tent's going to be up. Mm-hmm. And they're really there to see the trapeze act inside, which is your storytelling. Now, if you've only given yourself maybe 10% of your day to actually think about, well, how are you going to show and tell this so that anybody will remember? Well, you're in deep trouble. So what I've been doing this whole week, kind of a master storytelling class, is to give people kind of an efficient way to move through their day and quickly decide what's the point of my story. Because you go out and you get some information, even if you're on for a very short time, it kind of overwhelms you. But what I'm saying is, all right, here's the A, B, C good material, and so set that aside. Now you don't have 40 things to think about. You've got the 12 A pieces. The easiest thing to change is your storytelling. So you go with what you got. And then I give them some kind of tips to say, okay, this is a quick way of finding that central character. This is a quick way of finding the depth of the story that isn't apparent, because lots of times you just have kind of like a press release. And then if you can ask that question, let them fill the silence, they come up with something. Even if you don't put it in your story, it gives you a better idea of how this story differs from all the other stories that you've ever done. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just stressing what you guys hear all the time here at Syracuse, but I'm saying let's just step back for a second and look at the process and think about it, as opposed to just worrying about getting your lens cap off and your microphone in close, which is what we do anyway. But the other side sometimes gets overlooked, and it's the most important thing we do, is to figure out how to craft a good story.
Now, on a more personal note, when you were 2 years old, you were diagnosed with polio. Do you ever look back and marvel on the fact that you went from a polio diagnosis and not being able to walk to being a man who has traveled more than 4 million miles telling every story under the sun?
Well, I figure I won the lottery, not just the New York State lottery, every lottery, and because to be able to travel on somebody else's nickel and to get up every morning and say, what can I learn today, among people who are still at bat, people who are interested, that's exactly what I dreamed. I mean, it's like I'm in the bottom of the 7th game of the World Series. It's exactly what I dreamed my life would be. I bumped into a guy named Charles Kuralt, who was me 30 years ago. And when I was a student coming out of Syracuse, he said, Bob, all the money in the world is sitting on a stool in New York City, but all the fun is out there. And if you can get somebody to pay you to go have fun, then you've won. And I've kept that in mind, because every job is a job. And hardly anybody allows you to do what you'd like to do. I mean, I came out of Syracuse doing documentaries, long form stuff. And I get to NBC and they wouldn't let me do a story over a minute 10. And every morning, every producer, every reporter would call in and say, hey, I need another 30 seconds. I got the second coming. And the boss would say, great, but after a minute 10, you're done. So instead of that, I decided I would do every story for an entire calendar year at 59 seconds. Not a minute 1, 59, and every morning the boss gets 11 seconds back. Then meantime, I thought long and hard, found a story that might last a couple minutes, and then I kept shooting it, the good grace of people who would let me borrow a camera, and then I'd bring it back and say, how can I make this better? And the editor would help me. And finally, on the anniversary, the year anniversary, I actually had a story in my back pocket. I walk into the boss's office, and I give him my little elevator pitch, because I knew they would only pay attention for 14 seconds. And I said, I think I can do this in 2 minutes if you could give me 2 minutes. And he looked at me and says, I'll give you 5. And that was 1957, and I had, 77. 57? You're kidding? 1977, and until I retired in 2015, I had 5 minutes on the Today Show. And years later, I asked the guy, his name was Joe Bartlemy, why he made that decision. And he said, well, I figured if you could handle 59 seconds, you could do 5 minutes, but not necessarily the other way around. Because if you start with a lot of time and you squander it by saying, well, I just want my shot of the touchdown to go a little longer, or maybe I got the governor's and he's smiling and he says my name 2 times, so I'm going to put that in, and the audience doesn't care. Because we've all watched stories that are very short, that seem like 6 hours long, and then other stories that are, long, and you just hope they never end because they're so great. It comes down to the craft. It's the reason that a comedian can make a 4-year-old laugh and an 80-year-old laugh. It's what they put first, what they put second, and how they pay it off in every story they do. So I try to do that, whether it's breaking news, long, short, whatever. And of course, in the process, I've had a great amount of time, a lot of fun, because I've been around seemingly ordinary people who do something extraordinary, and therefore I have unique story subjects, because everybody else is chasing the governor or the coach. And I said, well, maybe there's somebody besides that actually will appeal to my audience, to the people who are tuning in. And usually it's somebody who looks a lot like them. And you think that's them, and then they say, well, look at this. There's another side to it that you haven't considered, and this person is somebody you should pay attention to. And fortunately, for 40 years, they have.
So then it's been almost a year now, or just over a year, since you stepped down from the Today Show. Do you miss the open road at all?
Well, I'll tell you, it's just a different kind of open road. I've been doing speaking tours. I've been in 8 countries speaking about the American story. I had a book a couple years ago that became a New York Times bestseller. And it turns out that apparently there's a lot of people who have a brother or sister in Skaneateles, whether they're in South Korea or Geneva or wherever. And so I started getting speaking requests, and we put together a tour to talk about the real America, not just what they see in our politics or watch in the movies or even read in the gangster books, you know. Because the story of America is the story of the world, you know, because there's like 181 different countries represented on Manhattan Island alone. And if you put in the native tribes, there's 586 different nationalities. Because if you ask somebody who's a Kiowa or a Lakota, they will talk in terms of somebody from Greece or Ireland. Totally different. You know, the movies called them Indians, but all right. So the question is, how did they get along? Why did this experiment, more or less, even though we're divided politically, how come it works? And so almost everybody somewhere in the world has somebody over here, and they're interested in that. And of course, the stories that I tell them are based on just seemingly ordinary people who turned out to be their brothers and sisters and ancestors and what have you. So I've been traveling just as much, but I've been to places I haven't ever been to for a while, or maybe at all. So that's been fun. And then of course I've got grandkids, so you know, I've got more time to actually see friends and do, and that's where I am in life.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you for having me.